Hello, and welcome to the video called Understanding the Structure of a Deal Part 1, Levers. In this video, we're going to be introducing the concept of three things called lanes, lifts, and levers, and then we're going to dive deeply into the levers section, which is essentially 11 different ways that you can get paid in a transaction. So after we do the introduction, we'll talk about each one of the 11 different ways that you can get paid, and then we'll talk about the pros and cons about having a simple transaction versus a more complex transaction. Okay, let's get started. In the process of having an eyes wide open exit, you need to be thinking about three different X, Y, and Z axes, if you want to call them that. The first one is lanes. Lanes define the type of transaction that is going to be best for you and for as the owner, the business, and the market. The typical lanes here are debt, preferred equity, minority equity, majority equity, cash plus contingent, or 100% guaranteed deals. Next up is levers. These are the 11 different ways that you can get paid, as you can see alongside the left. And then the third one is the ability to match up your lanes and your levers with various lift scenarios in your business. And those are the worst, base, and best case scenarios that you have so that you can see a range of outcomes for your transaction. Okay. Before we get into the lanes and all of the different details there, it's important to understand levers because levers are essentially the heartbeat, so to speak, of the economics of your transaction. Let's walk through them in detail. Okay, and this first graph will be a little bit smaller to see, but we're going to go through each one of them in more detail. The first one is the non-contingent payments that you receive that are guaranteed, meaning they're not based on any performance, but they are oftentimes not secured like a bank loan. Next up is contingent payments, stabilizations, and earnouts that are paid to you at a future point in time based on the business. Then roll to equity, which is the ability essentially to sell part of your company now and part later. Then you have what's called a balance sheet true-up, which pays you for things like your inventory and your net working capital. And then you have your post-acquisition compensation, which is any amount that you get paid after the sale. Non-contingent payments. The definition of a non-contingent payment is any payment that's not dependent on the performance of the business post-acquisition. It's separated typically into cash at closing, or for most e-commerce companies or Amazon companies, upon successful migration of your accounts. I like to think of it as 100% guaranteed, but maybe 98%, although it's very, very rare to not have a migration happen. And in fact, in my 5 or 6 years at Northbound doing hundreds of millions of dollars in transaction, we've never not had a migration happen. Next up, that is not contingent, is a holdback. A holdback is essentially money that is held back from your proceeds in case there are any future claims against the buyer who now owns it that were actually your fault. And it's typically released to you in 12 or 24 months' time. The third type of non-contingent payment is what's called seller financing, which is essentially the buyer asking you to finance over time the payments that they owe you. It's typically 90 days to a couple years, but it's not based on performance. It's often paid with some kind of an interest rate attached to it. And it's important to recognize that rarely is it ever secured. Most of the time, you're always behind the senior lenders, and a lot of times you're unsecured. So if your buyer, in essence, goes into default, you might not even get the seller financing. So that's part of your buyer due diligence. That covers the non-contingent payments. Next up is the contingent payments. This is any payment that is dependent on the future performance of the business. The first one, and these are really different types of earnouts, but I like to break out a stabilization payment into its own category because it's generally paid over a little bit shorter period of time, 1 or 2 years. But the big thing is that it's not paid based on growth like oftentimes earnouts are. It's paid on remaining similar to where you were today. And sometimes it might be negotiated at 100%. Other times you might be able to get it down to 90%. But the point is it's if the business stays stable. Earnouts are paid based usually on a flat dollar of achievement, usually based on, for example, if you get from 700,000 of earnings to 800,000, you'll get another payment. Or they're paid on reaching a percentage growth rate, a 10%, 20%, or 30% growth rate. And here's a key negotiating tip that's oftentimes not done. A buyer will oftentimes propose, if you get to 800,000, I'll give you a payment of another 100 grand. And if you get to $1 million, I'll give you a payment of 200 grand. But there are gaps in that area, or what I like to call cliffs. And the best way to negotiate earnouts is through something called pro rata negotiation, pro rata payments rather than cliff payments, because it gives you a better chance to maximize your valuation. Next up is rolled equity, or if it's a stock deal, it's called retained equity. And this is essentially any portion of the business that you're not selling on day one, but instead are receiving it at a future point in time, the economics from it. Rolled equity is really a good thing to use when you believe that the buyer's resources are going to be able to grow the company so that in 1 or 2 years' time, it's more valuable. And oftentimes in successful rolled equity transaction, for example, if you sell 70% of it today and 30% of it in 2 or 3 years from now, that 30% of it might pay you more than what the 70% did today. There are a couple different types of rolled equity, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds on this, but you can get rolled equity in what's called your individual performance. So think of it if you're selling to an aggregator in the marketplace, and you decided to sell 80% of it today, and then 10% of it you wanted to roll equity in the future of your particular brand. But there's also a second tier called Topco equity, where you may be able to negotiate stock in the actual aggregator or buyer themselves based on a number of different factors. And that is a different tier of equity. So I want to make sure that we describe both of those. And then economically, retained equity and rolled equity are almost essentially the same. They're just used in different types of transactions. So don't get too lost in the differences between whether it's retained or rolled. It's essentially whether or not you're selling a part of the business today or all of it. Next up is the balance sheet true-up. And this is essentially, the first part of this is called cash-free, debt-free. Almost every transaction is going to be structured like this, and it means that whatever cash that you've built up in the company, you get to keep, but whatever debts that you've built up in the company, you have to pay off, other than typically supplier payments, which are usually rolled forward in some different fashion. Next up is inventory. Oftentimes it's treated as a separate transaction, but sometimes it's actually included in what's called a net working capital calculation and included in the offer. So you need to make sure to validate that. And then your net working capital, if it doesn't include your inventory, is still there, and it's defined as your accounts receivable less any trade payables that you have. And all of these, if you sell your business, will be adjustments to the purchase price. And then finally, it's whatever you might get paid for any post-acquisition salary or consulting work you do, or in some cases, you might even have a negotiated profit share as a go-forward executive in the business. Okay, now that we've walked through those details, I hope you're having a more sophisticated understanding of what a transaction actually can look like. Well, let's take a look at it with some of the numbers here. So as you can see in this example, we've got $1 million worth of earnings called EBITDA, and we've got a 4 multiple in there. The first section is that we've decided that we're going to roll 25% of the business going forward, split between individual and Topco. So as you can see, the 4 multiple along the right is actually a purchase price multiple of 3. And the reason that the purchase price multiple is only 3 is because think of it as essentially you only sold 75% of the company, so you still own the other 25%, which means that it wasn't included in the purchase price. Next up was the cash at closing. And as you can see here, the cash at closing was a 1.5 multiple of cash, an escrow amount, and then some seller financing. So of the $3 million purchase price, $2 million of it is non-contingent in those various buckets. Next up is one stabilization payment worth $500,000 and one earnout payment worth another $500,000. As you can see, that means that there's another one multiple on this particular transaction related to the contingent payments of the business. In the balance sheet true-up section, you notice that you have inventory at net of about $250,000, and you have another networking accounts receivable of $250,000, and that's referred to as your balance sheet adjustment before we get to your cash-free, debt-free adjustment. And for right now, I've just limited not having a cash-free, debt-free adjustment in there for this particular example. So as you can see, all of those items are in there with the exception now of your post-acquisition compensation. And in this example, we're assuming that someone's getting paid a nominal $5,000 a month or $60,000 a year for 2 years. The important point is to recognize that not all of these will be included likely in your transaction, but the point is you need to understand all of the different levers. And when we're negotiating with different types of buyers, what we do is we outline a deal structure. And in essence, what we're doing is pulling down on all of these levers and seeing which ones are amenable for a buyer to adjust and which ones are not. It's a great way to help maximize the valuation of your company. So I encourage you, if you need to rewatch this video a few times and or you have this now in your workbook, actually design a sample transaction so that you understand all of the deal components that are out there. Okay, you may be thinking, wow, this sounds like a really complicated way to get a deal done, and I don't know if that's me or if I want to go through that process. And here's the way to think about it. First of all, the pros of doing a simple deal is that they are easier to close because they have fewer moving parts, and that means there's usually less deal breaker arguments to have. And that's critical because every day a deal isn't closed is a day that deal can fail. So the primary benefit is also a faster paced deal gets done. And then sometimes what you'll find is that simpler deals have less seller costs, less advisory, less legal, less accounting, those types of things. The cons, though, is that often simple deals proposed by buyers cause you to have to leave money on the table. And I never like to design a deal that's simple if it's going to cost you money in terms of a lower valuation. And often, not just on the economics, but simpler deals tend to have less seller protections unless you were smart enough to negotiate them. And finally, a lot of times the simpler deals are sort of your cash only or those types of buyers where it's sort of a zero-sum game and they can be less collaborative. So there's no one right answer as to the right transaction, but here there is one right framework. In order for you to have an eyes wide open exit and feel confident about your deal, it's critical for you to understand the strategic and the financial implication of lanes, levers, and lifts. And we've started with the levers section in this video. Once you have all of these deal tools, think of them as tools that are in your toolbox, you can then selectively decide to use them to balance a simpler transaction with one that maximizes your valuation and provides you with the appropriate amount of protection as a seller. Understanding the different ways that you get paid, in my mind, is obviously the most fundamental aspect of any transaction. This foundation allows you to start the negotiation and move past a very simple, what's my multiple, onto a detailed understanding of all the potential payment levers that you can pull. Thank you.